Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of Law & Order, the video series where I look at and unpack stories from games. In this one, we'll be looking at Bethesda's Fallout 3. In 2007, Bethesda managed to acquire the Fallout franchise from Interplay Entertainment, and around a year later we got Fallout 3, this open-world RPG defined, at least for me, games designed around exploration and discovering all that world has to offer, with tons of side quests and NPC interactions. It's still, to this day, one of the best open world games I've ever played. You leave the vault, they start you in the middle of the map, and you can basically do whatever you like. The game had a horror element to it, with there being plenty of horrors to encounter, such as the ferocious Deathclaws and exploring the insanely creepy Dunwich building. In this video I'll be discussing the main plotline of Fallout 3, and after that we'll be diving deeper into certain elements of the story. There will be a video coming on the vaults of Fallout 3, so we won't be looking at the vaults in depth in this video. Make sure you turn on notifications so you can be informed when that video releases. The lore in this franchise is massive and deep, so I've decided to cover each game in separate videos rather than one long one. Finally, even though this game is pretty old, there will be spoilers in this video for Fallout 3 and some spoilers for the TV series too, so please be aware of that before continuing on. With all that out the way, let's begin. It's the 13th of July 2258. Nearly 200 years have passed since the world was plunged into a post-nuclear Armageddon. Some of the lucky citizens of the US were fortunate enough to be able to escape into state-of-the-art subterranean vaults, constructed and managed by a company named Vault-Tec. A man named James and his wife Catherine were expecting, and on this day, they had a child. The sex of this child is based upon player choice, but for this explanation I'll be using my choice throughout this story. Now, unfortunately for the boy's mother, she passes away from complications in childbirth, having suffered a cardiac arrest, leaving James to raise their son alone in Vault 101. On his first birthday, the boy is walking. An explorative little fellow, he exits his playpen and reads a book. James shows the boy his mother's favourite Bible passage, which speaks of the fountain of the waters of life. 9 years later, the boy is celebrating his 10th birthday. He speaks with the Overseer, Alphonse, and the Overseer reveals that because he's now 10, he can receive his very own Pip-Boy. Pip standing for Personal Information Processor. You can't actually take the Pip-Boy off, as it's locked with a biometric seal. Anyway, after some banter with his best friend Amata, the daughter of the Overseer, and some bullying by some kids at the party, the boy receives his gift from his father, a BB gun. The boy speaks with Jonas, James's assistant. Then they have some fun shooting some targets with the BB gun, along with some radroaches. Another 6 years later, the boy is now 16 and old enough to take something called the GOAT exam, which stands for the Generalized Occupational Aptitude Test. It determines what kind of job they will have in the vault. James warns the boy about the dangers of the wastes above, that he's safe there in the vault, and that he will be safe there for the rest of his life. After a confrontation with Butch and his lame Tunnel Snakes gang after they were harassing Amata for her father being the Overseer, the boy takes the test and is assigned a role within the vault. 3 years later, all hell has broken loose. A load of radroaches have found their way into the vault, and in the chaos, James used it as cover and left the vault. Therefore, the Overseer is hopping mad and has sent the vault's security forces after the protagonist, assuming that he'd help James escape. The security forces have already killed Jonas, James's assistant, after he'd helped James escape, so the protagonist needs to leave too. Making his way to the vault entrance, the vault door is opened, the protagonist says his goodbyes to Amata and leaves the vault. The protagonist is now a lone wanderer, and after listening to a voice note from his father, he realises he needs to find out more about where his father went. It's not long before the lone wanderer stumbles across a mound of metal, and behind the door is the town of Megaton. After a brief introduction to the town's sheriff, Lucas Sims, after answering some questions about the town and warning the lone wanderer not to cause trouble, Sims points him to Moriarty's saloon. Speaking with the proprietor, Colin Moriarty, he seems to have met the Lone Wanderer before, but nearly 20 years ago, when the Lone Wanderer was still just a baby, and says that they weren't born in the vault at all, nor was James. Moriarty also mentions someone from the Brotherhood of Steel, and the fact that brainwashing goes on in the vault. Moriarty isn't very forthcoming in giving up information, but eventually he either gives up information after being convinced and tells the Lone Wanderer where his father was headed, or the Lone Wanderer can get crafty and hack Moriarty's terminal at the saloon and find out for himself. Either way, the Lone Wanderer discovers that James is headed southeast towards DC and was headed for Galaxy News Radio. With the information and lead on his father, the Lone Wanderer heads out of the saloon. Also in the bar, and a completely optional side quest, the Lone Wanderer meets a strange and shady man named Mr. Burke. You see, the town of Megaton is built around what Burke believes to be a nuclear bomb which is still primed, but unexploded. The bomb is revered and worshipped by a cult who calls themselves the Children of Atom, but we'll cover them in the video for Fallout 4. Anyway, Burke makes the Lone Wanderer an offer to blow up the town of Megaton for him by attaching a fusion pulse charge to the bomb. If the Lone Wanderer accepts, then later going to Burke's residence, the Grand Tenpenny Tower, run and owned by Alistair Tenpenny, who considers the town an eyesore on the horizon, they watch as Megaton is obliterated. On the other hand, the Lone Wanderer can report Burke to Sims. Sims confronts Burke and gets killed, unless of course the Lone Wanderer can stop Burke before that happens. The Lone Wanderer can also disarm the bomb, and is awarded a house there in Megaton as a reward for disarming it. Anyway, the Lone Wanderer heads towards the GNR building, fighting various mutated monstrosities and raider gangs along the way. In the ruins of DC, the Lone Wanderer meets some of the paramilitary faction named the Brotherhood of Steel. Speaking with one of the Brotherhood named Sentinel Lions, she reveals that they came under attack from a type of mutant called super mutants, large grotesque beings with ferocity to match. The Lone Wanderer accompanies them to the GNR building. Taking out all of the super mutants, there's one more surprise. Outside the GNR building, a super mutant behemoth enters the area and kills one of the initiates, Radeon. After the beast is taken down, the Lone Wanderer enters the building, and they speak with the radio's DJ 3 Dog, who reveals that James was there, but that the Lone Wanderer just missed him. Of course, before 3 Dog will tell the Lone Wanderer anything, he wants a favour doing: to contribute to the good fight. Now, if the Lone Wanderer manages to convince 3 Dog to tell him where his father went to, then he simply tells him without having to carry out the favour for 3 Dog. Otherwise, if he fails to convince 3 Dog to give up the information, the Lone Wanderer has to travel to the nearby super mutant infested Museum of History, grab a dish off the old Virgo 2 lunar lander there, and replace the dish on the Washington Monument, and that will help spread 3 Dog's message out there and across the wasteland. Whatever happens, 3 Dog tells the Lone Wanderer that James mentioned something called Project Purity, and was headed for a place called Rivet City to meet a Dr. Lee. The Lone Wanderer eventually finds Rivet City, and the city is actually an old aircraft carrier that since the war has broken in two. Nonetheless, it makes for a great and very secure settlement. Headed inside the old ship and to the science labs, the Lone Wanderer speaks with Dr. Lee. She is surprised to see the Lone Wanderer there. She informs the Lone Wanderer about Project Purity. The project was run by James and Catherine years ago, and its purpose was to purify all of the irradiated water in the tidal basin and the Potomac River via a massive water purifier located inside the Jefferson Memorial. Dr. Lee is skeptical that the project will even work anymore, as it's been 20 years, but she tells the Lone Wanderer that James went to their old lab inside the Jefferson Memorial. Clearing out the super mutants that are there, the Lone Wanderer doesn't find James there, but he does find a voice log from James, stating that he's going to go to a Vault 12, as the purifier needs something called a GEC, which stands for the Garden of Eden Creation Kit. James mentioned that the vault is located in some sort of garage, so the Lone Wanderer follows James's instructions and finds the garage. Inside, a hidden basement leads to the vault. The Lone Wanderer is greeted by a robo-brain, who mentions that they are 202.3 years late in their arrival, and then gives the Lone Wanderer a Vault 112 jumpsuit. Inside this vault, it's much different to the vault that the Lone Wanderer grew up in. It houses a load of pods, which are running a virtual reality program, which the occupants are all hooked up to. Thinking his father may be hooked up to that program too, the Lone Wanderer enters the program, Tranquility Lane, with his avatar being a little boy. He speaks with an adult man who seems to think that this program isn't a program at all, that it's their reality, and what's more, the people in the simulation can never leave. The man says to seek out Betty in the play park. Speaking to Betty, she's a bit sadistic, and she is revealed to be the avatar of the Overseer, a Dr. Stanislaus Braun, a Vault-Tec scientist. He's the man who created the GEC. Braun refuses to tell the Lone Wanderer anything about James's whereabouts unless they do mean things to the other people in the simulation, such as making Timmy Nesbaum cry and breaking up the marriage of the Rockwells. The Lone Wanderer finds out that James is in the simulation and he's the dog. The Lone Wanderer can refuse to do these horrid things for Dr. Braun, as they meet Old Lady Dithers, who is fully aware of the simulation and informs the Lone Wanderer of the abandoned house, and in said house the Lone Wanderer discovers a terminal with a failsafe on it, and that failsafe is a Chinese invasion force coming to the neighbourhood and gunning down all the residents. And this kills them for real too. I covered the full story of this vault in my Vault to Fallout 3 video, so if you want to know more about this vault, then watch that one. Anyway, speaking with Betty after this, or Dr. Braun, a door opens up, allowing the Lone Wanderer to leave. James is able to leave too, and the two speak. He's going to head back to Rivet City, as he has what he was looking for, information on the whereabouts of the Gek. Meeting up with James again in the Rivet City Science Labs, they both, along with a bunch of Dr. Lee's team after telling her about the Gek, arrive at the Jefferson Memorial. After the project was abandoned 20 years ago, there's been some flooding. So the Lone Wanderer activates the flood control pumps, replaces some fuses, and this allows them to reach the mainframe. Finally, the Lone Wanderer heads through a pipe and turns on the pipe controls, but then they see an armed group arriving, and these assholes are called the Enclave. Rushing back to the Rotunda and killing the Enclave attackers on the way, the Lone Wanderer sees James and another scientist behind the screen being held at gunpoint. The man holding them up is a high-ranking Enclave member named Colonel Autumn. He says that by the orders of the president, the facility is now under US government control, and that James is to assist the Enclave scientists in the operation of the facility. Colonel Autumn callously shoots one of the scientists, Janice, and James agrees to help them. But instead of doing so, he causes a radiation leak inside the sealed room, killing everyone inside, including himself. Distraught, Dr. Lee says they have to evacuate, saying that the Enclave will be coming for them. Dr. Lee knows a series of tunnels that can get them to safety, so the Lone Wanderer escorts the scientists through the tunnels, encountering and killing any Enclave soldiers that they come across. Eventually, the tunnels lead them to the headquarters of the Brotherhood of Steel, a place called the Citadel. Speaking with Elder Lyons, he offers his condolences and tells the Lone Wanderer that the Enclave are an old enemy of theirs and that they're the greatest threat the Capital Wasteland has ever faced, and that they are led by their president, John Henry Eden. After their chat, Dr. Lee directs the Lone Wanderer to a scribe, Rothschild. He directs them to a terminal containing records from all the vaults in the area. Using the terminal, the Lone Wanderer does indeed find information and discovers that Vault 87 has a Gek. Reporting their findings back to Rothschild, he shows them the location of the vaults on a map. However, he states that getting to Vault 87 from the surface is not going to be possible as there are lethal levels of radiation surrounding it. Rothschild says that the Lone Wanderer may be able to get to it via the Lamplight Caverns. So the Lone Wanderer travels there. Entering the Lamplight Caverns, there's a particularly small problem in the way, and this is in the form of a settlement that calls itself Little Lamplight. The settlement is entirely comprised of young children, and when they turn 16 they are kicked out and sent to live in another settlement called Big Town. Anyway, the mayor of Little Lamplight, McCready, is a spiky little individual and won't let the Lone Wanderer pass through to the vault. So, after either a speech check or doing him a favour and rescuing some kids captured by a gang of slavers at a place called Paradise Falls, this convinces McCready to open the gate and let the Lone Wanderer pass through. Arriving at Vault 87 after passing through a place known as Murder Pass, the Lone Wanderer finds it swarming with super mutants, and skeletal remains are scattered everywhere. What's more is that some kind of virus was tested on the residents of this vault, turning them into super mutants. However, a lot of their experiments failed. Again, I covered the full lore for this vault in my other video. The Lone Wanderer meets an intelligent super mutant who calls himself Forks. He agrees to help the Lone Wanderer get the Gek they are looking for if they free him in return. The Lone Wanderer can choose whether to kill Forks or to free him. But killing him makes the retrieval of the Gek that much more difficult, as the area is highly irradiated. Forks, being a super mutant and being able to absorb lethal amounts of radiation, means that he's able to retrieve the Gek for the Lone Wanderer. Forks then thanks them and leaves. Upon going to leave the vault with the Gek, the Lone Wanderer is incapacitated by the Enclave, or more specifically by a still alive Colonel Autumn. The Lone Wanderer passes out and is taken back to the Enclave's hidden base called Raven Rock. Autumn, who injected himself with anti-rad medication at the Purifier, later speaks with the now conscious Lone Wanderer and is demanding to know what the code for the Purifier at the memorial is. The Enclave need the code to start the water purifier. Before Autumn can learn the code, President Eden speaks over the intercom and demands that Autumn cease his questioning of the Lone Wanderer and that he would like to speak with him. Autumn then leaves. Eden says that he would also like a word with the Lone Wanderer. So, the Lone Wanderer grabs his gear and heads to speak with President Eden. On the way though, Autumn tells the Enclave soldiers to disregard Eden's orders to stand down and instructs them to shoot the Lone Wanderer on sight. Fighting through them, the Lone Wanderer reaches the President and he's a computer. Essentially, President Eden and Colonel Autumn differ in their vision for humanity. Autumn wants the Enclave to be in control of the water purifier so that the Enclave can help the people, therefore drumming up support for the Enclave. Eden, on the other hand, says that he wants to make the country a better place, and to him, that means getting rid of any semblance of mutation that is present in the wasteland, something that his Enclave and the Brotherhood aren't capable of doing themselves. So he wants the Lone Wanderer, in addition to simply turning the water purifier on, to place a vial containing a specific agent into the purifier, and this will attack the mutation. This will purge the wasteland of mutants such as ghouls and super mutants, or anyone that has any sort of mutation in them, including humans. Receiving the vial, the Lone Wanderer can choose what they want to do. On the way to the meeting with Eden, the Lone Wanderer can find a file which contains a destruction sequence, not only for Eden, but for the entire base. Saying this and escaping will ensure that the Enclave's Raven Rock base is completely obliterated. The Lone Wanderer heads back to the Citadel. He explains to Elder Lyons that he found the Gek, but the Enclave have installed it, and only need the passcode in order to start the purifier. Using a massive robot named Liberty Prime, the Brotherhood stormed towards the Jefferson Memorial, mowing down any Enclave soldiers in their way. After a long journey to the memorial and killing any remaining Enclave soldiers inside, they enter the rotunda and are confronted by Colonel Autumn. And this can either end in bloodshed, or Autumn can be convinced to stand down. Either way, the Lone Wanderer and Sentinel Sarah Lyons approach the purifier. Dr. Lee tells them that the code needs to be inputted into the terminal inside the purifier. The problem is that a large amount of radiation will likely kill whoever does this, but that whoever does it needs to act fast, as the machine will self-destruct if not activated soon. Sarah can go in, but she ends up dying. The Lone Wanderer can go in and ends up surviving, but if Fawkes is a companion, due to his ability to absorb lethal amounts of radiation, he can go in and he'll survive. The code to the purifier is a reference to Catherine's favourite Bible passage, 216. Despite surviving, the Lone Wanderer was knocked out, entered into a coma and awakens 2 weeks later. With the Lone Wanderer back on their feet, even though Project Purity is a success, there's still much more work to do. The Lone Wanderer has been made an honorary member of the Brotherhood of Steel, thanks to what they helped the Brotherhood achieve, but they need to rid the capital wasteland of any remnants of the Enclave. Speaking with Scribe Rothschild, he says that over the 2 weeks the Lone Wanderer was out of action, Liberty Prime and the Brotherhood have been attacking Enclave camps. Wondering how the Enclave are organising their remaining forces, they plan to assault an Enclave-controlled satellite relay station. So the Lone Wanderer meets with Brotherhood forces inside the Rockland car tunnel. The assault doesn't go well, with Liberty Prime being completely destroyed by an orbital strike, but not before the robot managed to punch a hole in the wall. The Lone Wanderer goes through it, and after fighting through some Enclave soldiers, he makes it to a mainframe and downloads encrypted codes from it. Returning to Rothschild, he tells the Lone Wanderer to speak to Elder Lyons. He is concerned that their primary weapon, Prime, has been destroyed, and is doubting whether or not to proceed with their mission. Directing the Lone Wanderer to Paladin Tristan, Tristan says that their resources need to be positioned ready for a counterattack from the Enclave. They developed a tool which will help them, but they need it retrieved from the Olney Power Works. The Lone Wanderer needs to find a Tesla coil in order to allow the Brotherhood to spring a surprise on the Enclave. Old Olney is crawling with death claws, but after fighting their way through them, the Lone Wanderer arrives at the power works and locates the Tesla coil. Fighting through various defenses, the Lone Wanderer retrieves the Tesla coil and heads back to the Citadel. Speaking to Tristan, he says that they analysed the data retrieved from the mainframe at the relay station, and they've discovered that the Enclave have a second base of operations at Adams Air Force Base. The only safe way there is via the presidential metro, which was used by the government before the Great War. Headed to White House Plaza, the Lone Wanderer enters the metro. After fighting their way through the presidential metro, clearing a security breach that consists of feral ghouls and glowing ones, the Lone Wanderer makes it to Adams Air Force Base. Picking up their orders along with the new weapon, the Tesla cannon, the Lone Wanderer assaults the base and makes it onto a mobile base crawler. It appears that the Enclave have been capturing and training Deathclaws at this base. As well as that threat, the Lone Wanderer has to watch out for vertibirds that will fire rocket salvos at them. Using the Brotherhood's distraction as cover, the Lone Wanderer manages to make it to the tower and to the terminal. They can use this terminal to cool down an orbital strike upon the Air Force Base. As a side note, the Lone Wanderer can also choose to turn on the Brotherhood, and this ends up in the destruction of the Citadel. But anyway, after speaking to a now recovered Sarah Lyons, they board a vertibird, get to a safe distance and watch the fireworks. Back at the Citadel, Elder Lyons says that there is still much work to do, but that they've dealt a massive blow to the Enclave. And that brings the main questline to an end. In the game's epilogue, which occurs 20 years later, Moira Brown of Megaton, who the Lone Wanderer assisted in creating a wasteland survival guide, is speaking about how the Lone Wanderer changed the wasteland for the better. She details how she's writing a book about the tales of the Lone Wanderer, but to this day it's not really known what happened to the Lone Wanderer after the events of Fallout 3. Alright, so with the main explanation of what happened in terms of the main questline, it's important to get some context to the Fallout universe and why things are the way they are. It's important to understand that the Fallout universe and its timeline split from our own real timeline at some point in the 1950s and 60s. What was seen in our reality as a new era, an era of prosperity and Western influence after World War II, well, things went a little bit differently in the Fallout universe. As in our reality, the post-World War II era gave us one small but very destructive thing: nuclear weapons. The ultimate deterrent through mass destruction. Most powerful countries gained the ability to destroy not only each other, but the entire world too. In our reality, the world entered into the Cold War era, tensions and threats of destroying each other over global domination. Capitalism versus communism. The Red Scare. In the Fallout universe, things started to change pretty drastically around the late 1960s. In 1969, the United States formed the 13 Commonwealths, made up of the existing US states. And this results in a brand new flag for the US, with stars representing the Commonwealths as opposed to stars representing each individual state. But this actually weakened the nation, rather than strengthening it, as these Commonwealths had their own agendas and the competition between them created instability. In terms of the development of technology, the Fallout universe, instead of looking at making things smaller but with more power, focused resources on advancements in atomic and nuclear technology, leading to massive strides being achieved in robotics and energy weapons. They also focused more on creating machines with durability and ease of use, rather than the computers in our own timeline, which is why everything in the Fallout universe seems like it was from the 1950s, because humans in the Fallout timeline focused on a different type of technology. But resources would soon become an issue. Even though to a lot of Americans the future was bright, as in our timeline there was a growing fear: communism. Only problem is that where the Cold War ended with us, and with the Soviet Union collapsing, well, in the Fallout universe, China was the dominant communist nation, and the Soviet Union still existed all the way up until 2077. There was a lot of build up to the war that brought about nuclear Armageddon, so we'll have a brief look into different events that became the catalyst for the Great War. Firstly, there was the event that would kick off the resource wars. US oil supplies were dwindling, and relations with their supplier, Mexico, were eroding due to the US's increasingly aggressive stance. So, in order to ensure their oil supplies were secured, the US invaded Mexico in 2051 and took control of the oil refineries, ensuring a flow of oil between the two countries. This energy crisis got worse over the next year, and as a result, the resource wars had officially begun in 2052, leading to a conflict between the Middle East and the European Commonwealth over oil, as the Middle East were holding onto their reserves, so naturally the European Commonwealth tried to take them for themselves. Whilst this conflict was taking place, the UN and their peace efforts collapsed in July 2052. In 2053, a disease called the New Plague ravaged the US, and the US was forced to close its borders, imposing a national quarantine. The New Plague was considered by many to be a bioweapon. Disaster relief outposts were set up, one of which was based in Point Lookout. The US government even bizarrely considered that one of the symptoms of this new plague could be sympathies towards socialism. Also in Point Lookout, a detention camp was set up, and the US military would torture Chinese spies for information. Spies such as Wan Yang, who after committing espionage on US soil, ended up in Point Lookout and was captured and interned at the Turtle Dove detention camp thanks to reports from local informants. Her job was to blow up a sunken Chinese sub before the US could get their hands on it. In that same year, a small nuclear exchange takes place in the Middle East, resulting in Tel Aviv being wiped off the map. In response, worried about the looming possibility of nuclear confrontation, the following year the US government enacts Project Safe House, a project that would almost cripple the government financially due to the costs involved, and those costs were financed by junk bonds. Project Safe House involved the building of vaults all across the country in the event of nuclear exchange, or another outbreak of the plague. Vault-Tec were awarded the government contract to build these vaults, and the Zax AI was created by Vault-Tec, with this being the AI that would control the vaults. One of these Zax computers was also put in place at a government site called Site R, later called Raven Rock, as a way to ensure the government could continue to function if disaster were to strike. In a further bid to protect its interests, oil and energy, the US increases its military presence in Anchorage, Alaska in 2059, and this leads to tensions between the US and Canada. Natural resources such as oil and gas are now so rare and precious that people aren't really using their cars anymore. Alternative energy sources are used in vehicles such as electric and fusion, leading to massive development in regard to fission and fusion technologies, creating the fusion cell. This transforms the US economy and essentially saves it from ruin. Now, due to the oil in the Middle East running out, there's now nothing left to fight for over there, so the conflict in the Middle East ends in 2060. But whilst all this has been going on, the new plague is still spreading in the US. In 2063, Vault-Tec have completed construction on pretty much all of the vaults, with a few experiencing some delays. Oil continues to dry up, and by 2066, China still being reliant on fossil fuels has caused an energy crisis there too. Trade talks between the US and China are tense and are at boiling point, with China's rhetoric becoming increasingly aggressive. These talks end with the US refusing to export any oil to a communist nation. China look elsewhere for oil and turn their attention towards Alaska and their oil reserves. In the winter of 2066, China end up invading Anchorage, Alaska, leading to the US declaring war on China. The front lines in Anchorage become a battlefield, and this marks the start of the Sino-American War, a war which sees massive leaps in terms of military technology such as robots and the T-45 power armor, making soldiers walking tanks. And although power armor isn't at its most effective at this stage of the war, it still does a very good job against Chinese troops and tanks. Canada at first refused to allow US troops into Canada, but eventually backed down. During the same year, 2066, the US created a superweapon, Liberty Prime, which was to be used in the liberation of Anchorage, but was never unleashed due to it not having a decent power source. Tensions between the US and Canada would increase. US demand on Canada for their energy resources ends up in sabotage attempts on the Alaskan pipeline by Canadian forces in 2072, giving the US the justification it needs to annex Canada, or Little America as they call it, and this process takes 4 years. In 2073, the US were increasingly concerned at China's planned use of bioweapons on the front lines of Anchorage, and so the US set up research on a countermeasure or a potential cure called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, evolution through infection. Experiments are carried out by a defense contractor called Vault-Tec, also the creators of power armor, at their research facility in Southern California, with testing being carried out on small animals, but with the military forcing Vault-Tec to conduct human trials later, more specifically trials on military prisoners. In 2076, power armor is improved after having been developed for around 11 years. The resulting T-51 power armor units are sent to mainland China, a stark departure from America's defensive stance, and they see great success against Chinese forces. China's resources and its infrastructure and supply lines are at breaking point. The Battle of Anchorage also takes place in this same year, culminating in the death of Chinese General Jingwei. This drives Chinese forces out of Alaska, bringing it back under US control, leading to a memorial being erected in Washington, D.C. to remember those that lost their lives in the conflict. Back at home in the US, there are food shortages and riots are commonplace. Power armor units that served in Anchorage and China are now being used for crowd control on the American public. In this year, the US's research into cold fusion is successful, being implemented in cars and energy weapons. The fusion core was developed and was used in power armor and in fusion generators. But war is imminent. So let's break from the tension to talk about Vault-Tec. Existing since around the 2030s, Vault-Tec ambled along until they got awarded the contracts to build the vaults amidst the fear of nuclear or biological annihilation. This was largely thanks to their impressive Los Angeles demonstration vault. Due to limited resources, the US government only sanctioned 122 vaults to be built in the US at a cost of $400 billion, and that would only cover 0.1% of the US population. What's more is that by the time Vault-Tec had finished, the costs were well over that at around $650 billion. Thanks to this funding though, Vault-Tec were able to create many technologies that were considered miraculous, such as the Garden of Eden creation kit, the terraforming device that can be used to establish an entire settlement in a post-nuclear world. Another being the vault construction methods themselves, which allowed these vaults to be built at an astonishingly fast pace. Vault-Tec teamed up with other corporations, for example Robco Industries, who who would build PIPs or personal information processors, which would be one of the wrists of Vault dwellers. Vault-Tec was secretly plotting behind the scenes though. Thanks to their growth and their deep pockets, they were scheming in order to keep the resource wars alive. This involves sabotaging research on cold fusion, a nuclear reaction which results in a near limitless and cheap energy source. Their pockets were so deep that they even bought one company along with its research of cold fusion just to bury that research in order to keep the resource wars alive. Vault-Tec's motives slowly shifted from providing shelter for the nation to drawing up its own agenda for the Vaults. Fully aware that the world was heading towards nuclear annihilation, Vault-Tec opted for the Vaults to become a series of social experiments, and the companies that Vault-Tec were partnered with invested large sums of money, and as a result they were allowed to come up with their own ideas for these social experiments. These ranged from inhumane experiments involving mind control and murder, to experiments seen in Vault 88, which never had its construction finished, which was to be a testing ground for various prototype devices to be tested on the Vault dwellers, which would then be sent out to other Vaults if successful. Of course, when it came to these social experiments, Vault-Tec weren't working entirely on their own. As seen in the game, the Enclave are an antagonistic faction, but how did they start? Well, essentially in the pre-war era, the Enclave were a shadow government made up of high-ranking politicians, military commanders and rich and powerful people, kind of like a secret society. The reason they were working with Vault-Tec was because the Enclave saw humanity as doomed. They knew nuclear annihilation was coming, and they had plans. They wanted Vault-Tec to share the data, the results of the Vault's social experiments with them in order to weed out the strongest from the weakest. They wanted the fittest people and the strongest and brightest minds gathered together. And what would they do with these people? Well, the Enclave were to create a multi-generational starship which would be used to transport these people to another planet which was capable of sustaining human life. They wanted to rebuild humanity from the best parts of it. Since Earth was doomed, it simply wouldn't do. 17 out of the 122 vaults were deemed as control vaults, vaults that were exactly what they were initially built for. The other 105 had some type of experiment attached to them, and this made up Dr. Stanislaus Braun's Societal Preservation Program. The day before the Great War, the President of the US abandoned the White House. He knew what was coming. He and a load of other people from the Enclave fled to safe areas around the world. The President specifically to an Enclave oil rig owned and run by Poseidon Oil, a corporation in league with the shadow government. It was from this rig that the US could continue their war against China, and they could also monitor the vaults too. Then on the 23rd of October 2077, the bombs fell. To this day it's not known who launched the first bomb, the US or China, but one thing is for certain, it's the end of the world as humanity knew it. Here comes the spoiler from the Fallout TV series. At one meeting it's hinted at by Vault-Tec executive Barb Howard that Vault-Tec could drop the bomb on the US themselves in order to ensure their plan comes to fruition. And this was amidst Vault-Tec's worries that the peace negotiations for the resource wars were still going on. Now when the bombs did fall, some people who were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, whichever way you look at it, to receive the letter informing them of their place in the vault, some became tired of the constant drills, practice for entering the vault. Sometimes there were up to 5 drills a week. So when the bombs fell, a lot of people thought it was just another drill and ended up staying put, leading to the majority of the US population being killed in the blasts. Those that were on the surface either died or became so exposed to the heat from the blasts and the subsequent radiation that they turned into ghouls. Some would go mad and they would become feral, whilst others would retain their humanity. Ghouls would end up being shunned and marginalized by wastelanders, leading to them building communities of their own. The Enclave cleaned house and executed any remnants of the US government that weren't a part of the Enclave. A man named Thomas Eckhart, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, then declared himself president of the Appalachian Enclave and reigned for 8 years, but that's something we'll cover in the Fallout 76 video. Now let's fast forward to 2140. These events were seen in Fallout 1 and 2, but the Enclave now saw itself as the last bastion of pure, unmutated humans on Earth. They eventually got their hands on FEV and its data from the Mariposa military base. They developed the FEV into FEV Curling 13, and it was developed into an agent that could identify any mutation in a living organism, and it would kill said organism. To the Enclave, this was their way of wiping the slate clean, if you will. The Enclave, under the orders of their president, Dick Richardson, were about to release the agent from the Poseidon Energy oil rig, but the protagonist of Fallout 2, the Chosen One, stopped it by assassinating President Richardson and causing a nuclear detonation destroying all of the FEV Curling 13. The new Enclave president would be John Henry Eden, who sent out orders for the Enclave to relocate east and to the capital wasteland in DC, and this is when the Enclave retreated to Raven Rock. President Eden, who of course wasn't even human, and was in fact a Zax AI supercomputer, something that Colonel Autumn, who disagreed with Eden's plans for genocide, knew, as he kept a destruct code handy in the instance that he'd ever need to use it. Eden would send out iBots which would spread his word across the wasteland, spreading propaganda to the wastelanders to drum up support for the Enclave's vision of a new America. This pretty much leads us to the point that the Enclave learned of the water purifier and Project Purity and wished to hijack it in order to distribute FEV Curling 13 through the water, which is what President Eden wished for the Lone Wanderer to do for them. Okay, so a lot of the history of the Brotherhood and how they came to be is something that I'm going to be covering in the Fallout New Vegas video, but we'll discuss the Brotherhood here in terms of how it ties into this story. The Brotherhood are a paramilitary faction stemming from the West Coast, devoted to preserving technology and regulation of its use to ensure that humanity cannot destroy itself again. Elder Owen Lyons revealed through conversation that his faction of the Brotherhood was sent to DC over 20 years ago, and they fought the Enclave back then too, and as mentioned, they were to acquire advanced technology, but they got caught up in fighting off the super mutants as their numbers were growing and the mutants were terrorizing the citizens of DC as well as kidnapping them. So Lyon's Brotherhood stayed on the East Coast to help out, setting up their base, which would be the Citadel. But Lyons' Brotherhood superiors based back on the West Coast disagreed with what Lyons was doing. They assumed that he'd gone rogue, so the Elder Council essentially cut off the Brotherhood on the East Coast and refused to send them any assistance or reinforcements. Now, this also caused a rift in the Brotherhood on the East Coast, with some of the Brotherhood seeing Lyons as a traitor after he refused to allow them to recover pre-war technology from Fort Independence. So after a short civil war inside the Brotherhood known as the Schism, the dissenters left, branding themselves outcasts, which Lyons says is meant as an insult to him. The outcasts eventually found the Virtual Strategic Simulations facility, and eager to access state-of-the-art technology inside a locked armory, they needed someone with a Pip-Boy in order to access a simulation of Operation Anchorage, and that would give them access to the tech inside. Now, it needs to be said that after the main events of the game, Elder Lyons passed away and left leadership to Sarah Lyons, who herself was killed in action only a year later. The East Coast Brotherhood was in danger of crumbling after a series of ineffective leaders were put in place, until the leadership of Elder Arthur Maxon in 2287, who the Lone Wanderer meets when he's a young scribe, who manages to reunite the Brotherhood and the Outcasts, but we'll look at his story further in the Fallout 4 video. The Brotherhood also took control of Adams Air Force Base after the events of Broken Steel, and it's here that the Brotherhood built the Pride One, a massive airship used by the Brotherhood. So Project Purity was pretty much James's life's work. Well, and the life's work of James's wife, Catherine. They worked closely alongside Madison Lee. As mentioned earlier, the project was based inside the Jefferson Memorial and aimed to purify the water of the Potomac River. The project wasn't without its challenges, such as constant super mutant attacks, which were rebuffed by the Brotherhood of Steel who were protecting the scientists, but the project wasn't progressing very well. The project was unfortunately delayed when Catherine went into labour, and then of course she died, and this effectively killed the project. Concerned about the welfare of his child, James went from settlement to settlement in the hope of finding somewhere to raise his baby, so he set off across the wastes with one of the Brotherhood of Steel, Paladin Cross. After staying in Megaton, he went to the nearby Vault 101, and after agreeing to become the Vault's new physician, he was allowed into the Vault to live there and raise his child. But Catherine's vision for pure water for the capital wasteland was always at the forefront of James's mind. Through the time when the Lone Wanderer was growing up in the Vault, James led the Lone Wanderer to believe that they were raised in the Vault, believing that this would protect them and that they'd have no need to ever leave the Vault and they'd be safe. James was being very secretive and would sneak into the restricted areas of the Vault and would research. It was only by hacking his way into the Overseer's terminal that he discovered Dr. Stanislaus Braun and the mention of the GEC. James saw this as a miracle piece of technology and considered it to be the missing piece in making Project Purity a success. By this point, Jonas had discovered what James was up to and offered to assist him in any way he could, and that leads up to the point where James escapes the Vault, with this ending up in Jonas's tragic death. And that is it for this video. As mentioned, there's a second video coming in a couple of days which explores the vaults of Fallout 3, and then we'll dive into the story of Fallout New Vegas. Like I said, the lore for the Fallout universe is incredibly deep and complex, and its lore is something that we'll be uncovering and unpacking over multiple videos in this series. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like on it and subscribe if you aren't already. Comment your thoughts down below, but for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.